Welcome to another episode of Our Interesting Times. It's my pleasure to have Dr. Eric Karlstrom back on the show. He returns to discuss his research regarding gang-stalking, electronic harassment, surveillance, mind control. I guess we could kind of put this all under the broad category of mind control. Cybernetics is another term I hear often used, which I think is appropriate here. The exploitation of technology to control society. This is the whole purpose of trying occulted societies and occulted science, at least for my estimations. But Dr. Karlstrom, your website. How are you doing?
Very good, Tim, and it's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for letting me on there. Yeah.
You're certainly welcome, and thank you for coming back on. And your website, Gang-Stalking, Mind Control, cults.com. This website kind of provides, it's sort of educational research for individuals and interested in learning about organized gang stalking, electronic torture, mind control behavior, manipulation, cloning, and cults. So let's get into this. What's a good way to introduce people into this area and give them a broad understanding of what's going on?
Yeah, well, exactly. This is a huge subject, and I think it has the potential for genociding a very large portion of the human race. And so the quicker that we can help people understand what's going on, I think the better, because then we have a chance of turning this thing around, exposing it, and hopefully defeating it in its tracks. It is an enormous subject, and my Gang-Stalking Mind Control Cults.com website, I just put that up, I think, about a little less than a year and a half ago, and I've been posting on it like crazy. That website came out of my 911nwo.com website. I also have another website, naturalclimatechange.org, and another one, San Luis Valley Waterwatch.com, and then my musical site is erickarlstrom.com. I retired from a 30-year teaching profession with California State University, teaching geography in 2011, and I've been really applying my research skills or habit, whatever you want to call it, to subjects that I think are most important. So I've kind of moved from an earth science orientation to more political, and so this is why we find ourselves having this discussion. Along the way in 2013, I began to notice that I was targeted by this program. So I have the benefit still of sound mind and body, more or less, to be able to study this stuff as well as observe how it is being played out on me. And so let's just begin this way, Tim, if you don't mind. And again, I take a historical approach typically, because it does help provide the context. So let me just ask you a kind of a general question. I can probably get an ace on this test here. What do President John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, 28 Black Panthers, actress Jean Seberg, writer Ernest Hemingway, musician activist Judy Berry, for dead students at Kent State Massacre, Senator Paul Wellstone, David Koresh, General Patton, Admiral Borda, Dr. David Kelly, CIA Director William Colby, U.S. Secretary of Commerce Ron Brown, First Secretary of Defense James Forrestal, Deputy White House Counsel under President Bill Clinton Vince Foster, CIA Toxic Weapons Chemist Dr. Frank Olson. What do these people all have in common?
Well, they're all dead now.
Well, yeah, they're all dead,
and they were all assassinated. Yeah,
they're all assassinated. Yeah. The more or less political assassinations, because these individuals became troublesome to the power structure. So, indeed, the power structure has, for a long time, had a means of disposing of troublesome individuals in order to do what they call perception management. In other words, manage the direction, social engineering, manage the thrust, the direction of the culture. John F. Kennedy Jr., same thing, also plane crashes are very popular with this crowd. So, that explains Ron Brown and John F. Kennedy Jr. and many others. It's so easy to do and to deny. Now, if you go onto my website, I've notated several interviews that ex-military wife, Kay Griggs, did back in 1998, and then also one in 2005, in which she basically spills the beans and tells you how the structure works that does this. These professional assassins are often mind controlled. In fact, her conclusion is that the U.S. military is a mind control, gang-stalking cult operation run by sexual deviants who are mostly homosexually recruited at a fairly young age. They take very capable young men, and then they homosexually recruit them, give them scholarships to the top universities like Princeton, etc., and then control them for the rest of their lives so that they will take these various functions. And she names names. I've written them down. They're all on that post on my website. So, we're starting to get some breakthroughs in terms of understanding. I feel like we're starting to get some understandings of how this very complex program works. I began that way because, I wanted to give the kind of the broader historical context. And if we look deeper into similar programs in other countries, we can look at the East German Stasi police in which 1 out of 6 civilians was recruited with the top secret military police to spy on their fellows. COINTELPRO of the FBI in the 50s, 60s, and 70s certainly was responsible for some of the murders that I just mentioned. We can also look at other programs like the CIA's MH Chaos or the CIA's Operation Phoenix to see that there are ways to dispose of individuals within a society who are quote unquote not ideologically assimilated. Mm-hmm. But this program goes deeper than that, and of course we sometimes call it gang stalking. This is a very, very inadequate term. We call them targeted individuals, which of course is a military term. Target is an enemy or an adversary, or somebody that they're going to kill, or disable or disrupt or whatever. I've actually boiled it down, and you hit these points too in your introduction, Tim. It's not only gang stalking, and we do have now in Dr. Ronnie Kilda's book, Bright Light on Black Shadows, and I've transcribed it on my website. We do have a gang stalking manual that was used in Operation Gladio in Western Europe, in specifically Italy. And, we could add Prime Minister Aldo Moro to that list, of people who were unacceptably left-wing oriented and therefore had to be disposed of, along with hundreds of others in Western Europe by the Stay Behind Armies and Operation Gladio, which were organized, controlled, and funded by MI6, CIA, and NATO, by the way, with local affiliates. So, again, we look and we see that this program has real legs. It has, historical precedent. And I've got that information on my website. But it's not just gang stalking, which is a kind of a civil military operation. It's also mind control is being used. Also electronic warfare is being used, and cybernetics, computer control, as well as perhaps brain mapping, brain cloning. All of these things are conjoined in this diabolically evil program because the people that are, say, put on these terrorism watch lists, there's at least 2 million in America, are never informed of that, and they're not allowed to find out if they are because this is classified information. But then they become subject to these tests, to these weapons testing systems, to the mind mapping, to the gang stalking, etc. So, wow, this is we got a tiger by the tail here. This is extremely evil. It is extremely widespread, and a lot of people are being killed as we speak, being tortured with these programs. I'll stop for a second and let you have a word here, Tim, if you'd like to add something.
Well, you've mentioned, you should have alluded to the historical precedent here, and someone first hearing this is going to say, what is this guy talking about? This is crazy. Nothing like this can exist. It'd be exposed. People would talk and something this extensive. Yet we do have examples that are well documented, admitted now in history of other governments and also the U.S. government experimenting on people. We have the Tuskegee Project, of course, which is infamous, which is now known, and that was targeting black men, from what I understand. syphilis. We've had, and this reveals the malevolence of those people, the disregard they have for human life and individual rights and the Bill of Rights and the values that we supposedly hold dear in this country. And it also exposes just how renegade or how uncontrolled these agencies are, because they've been allowed to grow under cover. This is the problem of having a cryptocracy, a secret government, because there's no oversight. Now, the Senate Armed Services Committee, or the Intelligence Committee, cannot practice reasonable oversight over these things. Not only because, well, the infrastructure that you cite would enable them to sort of blunt or limit any meaningful oversight, whether it's blackmail or mind control or targeted assassinations by troublesome people, as you mentioned. The political process, the Congress, these things, the courts are completely unable to control these things through normal channels because it is secret. I think you mentioned, I was reading the article, there's some 6,000 contractors that are now involved in this, in sort of security operations or intelligence operations, operating under covert budgets. And then, of course, we have the issue of the black budget. I think on September 10th, 2001, Donald Rumsfeld spoke of $2.3 trillion got missing from the Pentagon budget. I think that tab's run up to close to $9 trillion since then. There's also what's occurred at Housing and Urban Development and other government agencies where money is just being embezzled, and there's no accounting for these trillions of dollars that have gone missing. And a lot of it's probably just gone to line the pockets of greedy insiders. But there's also suggests that through all that money, the trillions of dollars, they can do a lot with unlimited money, unlimited time, unlimited manpower, correct?
Absolutely. And I think there's a very strong possibility that some of these trillions have gone into this program, which I believe is very expensive. I think that they, like a targeted individual like myself would cost many millions of dollars to do. It's not a simple process at all. They might recover some of that, by asset stripping the targets, which is one thing that the syndicate does. The syndicate is I think the controlling arm of both the corporates and the military aspects of this thing. Kay Griggs attributes, the military, says they're just totally in bed with the New Jersey Brooklyn mob. The high levels of the Marine Corps, and her husband was Marine Corps.
Oh yeah,
and she said,
that goes back to the Operation Underworld during World War II.
Right. And then she says Israel is in on every single operation that they do. So all those names, most of those names that I rattled off, figure that Israel was involved as a direct partner with the U.S., shall we call them assassination teams and operations, including Oklahoma City and, the David Koresh, the Waco thing. I mean, these things are operations. Now, just a little more background here, Tim. I read Colonel Fletcher Prouty's book, The Secret Team, the CIA and its allies in control of the United States and the world, which came out in 1973. And he says, okay, the end of World War II, we dropped the atom bomb, on Japan. And military leaders and political leaders understood at that point that this was not a viable option for war in the future. So they're going to have to figure out a whole different way to do war. And this is, in fact, what they did.
I like that. Never do they stop to think maybe we should stop waging war.
Right, exactly. It's much more profitable. Just like Eisenhower said in his farewell address, watch out for the military-industrial complex that's going to pursue its own interests, And so anyway, so they changed the name of the, Department of War to the Department of Defense. And then according to Prouty, they would find other countries, which they wanted to, colonize in a neo-colonial situation, all the time saying, we're freeing them and, we're winning their hearts and minds. What they're doing, of course, is torture and murder and rape. I mean, Vietnam is a good example of that with Operation Phoenix. But what they do is they identify individuals in those countries that are kind of leaders, one way or another, and then they identify them. The CIA puts them on an enemies list, calls them insurgents, and then the military goes in and kills them. Okay, now you've got enemies, right? You've just attacked some people that and you've invaded their country, as in the case of Vietnam, and you've occupied it, as in the case of all these countries. And so then now what you're doing is counterinsurgency. See, we just play with the words here. Now we call it counterterrorism. But if you look at what Kay Griggs says, and if you look at actually how it has played out, all the terrorism is coming from the dominant powers. It's coming from the United States, Israel, Britain, etc. And it's being waged against the civilian population of the world, including Americans like myself. So we've changed the way we've done war. And in fact, then it gets even more changed in the 80s when we have this revolution in military affairs, in which they adopted what they call fourth generation warfare techniques, adopting electronic warfare weapons like as in Tesla technology. Now we're talking about silent and visible uses of the electromagnetic spectrum, which, had been tested through the 40s, 50s, 60s by the CIA and their MK Ultra program and others to become quote unquote non-lethal weapons. But of course that's a euphemism, because these things can be tuned up to be lethal and tuned down to be non-lethal. They have many capabilities, and so every aspect of the electromagnetic spectrum has been weaponized now by the powers that be. And it's not just, of course, the military. This is really well told in a book, Tim, called New World War Revolutionary Methods for Political Control by Mark M. Rich. And he outlines how the system works. Every branch of the military is completely able to carry on these operations. There's many other synonyms now that they use for fourth generation warfare. One of them is information warfare. One of them is unconventional warfare. Another civil military operations. Another one military operations other than war. In other words, this is military doctrine. No longer is a country going to go invade another country per se. We have hot wars still. But these special operations now are going to be conducted throughout the world. And we know in a newspaper article, I think in 2011, that these special operations were going on in 134 different countries. That's out of 190. So the U.S. then, it seems to be going for complete global control. The U.S. and the United States and its handlers, I'll say, its controllers, which are, I think this syndicate that Kay Griggs speaks about, has controlled the upper levels of the U.S. military and political establishment, as well as, of course, the media, et cetera. So anyway, we've got this different kind of warfare. And let me give you one example of that. And that's here's how of course, right after 9/11, we had in 2001, we had the North American Command established, NORTHCOM, for the first time. Now, all of a sudden, North America is considered part of the battle space because, the military has to be able to attack, quote-unquote, terrorists within our own space. Well, this then gives them the legal right then to conduct these operations against individuals and groups that are not, of the liking of the establishment. And as I mentioned, we now have a terrorism watch list and other watch lists. Millions of Americans are on these lists. They can't find out if they are, but they get targeted. And the FBI refers to them now as non-investigative subjects. Non-investigative subjects. Well, which means that, hey, there's no need for a FISA court, permission to go surveil and target these individuals. That means go ahead and conduct war against them. Go ahead and kill them. And this is exactly what's happening. And so we have now changed the laws with the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012, 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17. I'm sure it'll be reauthorized in 18. Which gives the military these powers then, these emergency war powers, of course, because 9/11 was supposed to be an act of war. Well, it was an act of war. It was an act of, terrorism by, the CIA and the Mossad against America and Americans and the world, as per all these false flag events that we're getting kind of wise to. So yeah, now we've got this. Let's just look at this one piece of equipment called C4ISR. Now what we have is a mobile command war room. C4 stands for Command, Control, Communications, Computers. So anybody, say a lieutenant anywhere, can get on his computer. And then ISR stands for Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance. Okay, now these things are going to be produced and sold by Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin and other contractors, sold to the military, and now, or they can be sold. Their own people can use this stuff. It doesn't even have to be the military now. Could be mafia, combination thereof. So this guy's got this computer system. It's connected to the Geographic Information Grid, which is the satellite system of many, many satellites. And then all TIs who are implanted with little chips, or maybe even not, with their own brain fingerprints, which can now be detected by the NSA. They all, and of course with their mobile phones and whatnot, they're very easy to identify where they are. Maybe their truck has a chip or whatever. So they're able to locate all individuals, pretty much, the targeted individuals, and the perps, the nodes on their computer screen who are, in the program, who become the civilian spies, who they can get to, walk in front of the TI, or tailgate them or do something to harass them. And most of these perps, they kind of sign away their souls when they become part of this program, as I understand it. There's a couple perps that have gone public and said, well, this is what it's like in the syndicate. And I've got those articles on my website. And once you're a perp, man, you're dead meat. You all are also available for these microwave testing experiments, etc. And if you rat on your fellow perps, I mean, they will take you out, So anyway, it's a very, very evil, diabolical system. So now we've kind of divided society into, wolves and sheep. In other words, we're going to have this team that's going to go hunt these sheep. And it's a little like the Hunger Games, or what's the other one? Survivor,
Yeah.
It's kill or be killed kind of thing, And if you decide to sell your soul, then you get the perks. You get the money, the retirement, the pretty girls or guys or whatever, and the new car, the new house. And if you're, of course, on the other side, then you're stripped of these things eventually.
It's interesting how those in charge, the psychological warfare specialists, would know. Yeah, they create the weaponry and the infrastructure to wage these things, like the cell towers. This is all done in the guise of communication and convenience, but these, like you said, can be easily weaponized. And now they have the infrastructure under the guise of telecommunications. But also they go through the effort of manipulating the culture, conditioning the culture, changing the culture to accept this type of satanic view through entertainment, like shows like Survivor.
Good point. Yeah, we're being psychologically conditioned. I think the psychological warfare is across the board. And what's happening to the TIs is just, the very worst of it. But the average American and even citizen in the world is a target of intense brainwashing and propaganda. One of the articles that I have posted by anonymous patriots who writing in State of the Nation say that, the Pentagon has a $4 billion a year budget to propagandize the American public. And of course they propagandize other countries as well. And the $4 billion can be used, and the term propaganda, the definition of propaganda, can be extended, according to the anonymous patriots, to these false flag events, such as Las Vegas and, what happened in Florida, blah, blah, blah. And that these are involving, crisis actors and blah, blah, blah. And this then is legal. This is legal. So what they've done is they've legalized treason with the National Defense Authorization Act and others. So the military people are in a terrible bind because, they, on the one hand, they've sworn an oath to protect the Constitution. On the other, they're in a chain of command, and the chain of command says, okay, do this. And, what they're doing is shredding the Constitution. So, very, very, very compromised. And then if you look at the higher levels, as Kay Griggs points out, many of these people would have been homosexually recruited, under MK Ultra mind control, and for them taking out a life is nothing.
Well, that's a pattern that you see in the intelligence community in terms of assassins, mechanics, agents. So they're how do they get them to do these things? Is they all emerge from dysfunctional families. And therefore they can easily be, either they're traumatized and they can easily be manipulated because of that background. Sort of It's a way, to identify people who are good candidates for this type of program. These are like, I guess, sociopaths that, or people you can turn into sociopaths or psychopaths.
Absolutely. Yeah, and Kay Griggs is brilliant in this. And I just have gone through these interviews again. These are 1998 interviews. And by the way, she was targeted and perhaps still is. But like Gloria Naylor, who wrote 1996, and like Dr. Ronnie Kilda, these extraordinarily brave women who wrote, Kilda wrote, she was the chief medical officer for Northern Finland and many degrees in medicine, so medical doctor. And she wrote Bright Light on Black Shadows. These women have, figured out what's going on. And, even while they're being tortured under this program, and then managed to write about it. Kay Griggs managed in these interviews to basically expose the whole system. She's a Christian and very well connected politically with the state of Virginia. She's a descendant of James Madison. Mm-hmm. She's got a bachelor's in Virginia history, a master's in Scottish history. Not a stupid woman, and of course, a total insider politically from the time she was born. And then she married this Marine Corps assassin, who she got to realize was a raging alcoholic. And in his raging alcoholic diatribes, his stupor, he spilled a lot of the beans. And so she remembers all this stuff and recorded it and has it in these interviews. And she mentions, these people tend to be, like her husband would say, he's an existentialist. And that means you do whatever's necessary, and it's not murder because, hey, it's not personal. It just what needs to be done, Mm-hmm. So, but she said this guy was basically a robot, except when he was drinking. And then he would get very animated and tell, all the operations, And of course, he was real big in the Iran-Contra scandal in the 80s. He's a good, colleague of people like George H.W. Bush and Henry Kissinger and Brent Scowcroft, and, go down the list of the names, and extremely connected with our top people.
Yeah, but the problem most, they hear those names, George H.W. Bush, the 41st President of the United States, Henry Kissinger, Brent Scowcroft. These are establishment men. And it's hard for them to accept these household names are connected to, to such behavior. But then again, it goes to the question of identifying the true nature of the system.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And, when she was being targeted, and this is a bright woman, and you should listen to these interviews if you have the time. She's in Virginia. She has been flagged, as she used that term, by some of the generals that were her husband's colleagues for being a troublemaker. Okay, so then they want to kill her and take her out, as per, the gang-stalking system. And so she's being flagged. And she happens to be at Goodwill, and she finds this, of course, Norfolk, Virginia, she says, has got more concentration of military and intelligence operatives than anywhere else in the world. She's at the Goodwill. She finds this field manual of the U.S. Army called Intelligence and Electronic Warfare Operations, FM 34/1. And she's smart enough to read it. And she says, well, this is what they're doing to me.
Was it written by Colonel Aquino?
This would, I don't know, this would be going back to 1983. Yeah. Aquino wrote the Mind War paper back in the 80s. But, there's a lot of these people. Certainly Aquino would be one, and, others like Dr. John Alexander, the guru of non-lethal weapons, But, these are operations that have now turned on the American citizenry who they want to use one way or the other, or want to dispose of one way or another. And like you say, it's very difficult for Americans to realize that, hey, our establishment is comprised of many of these individuals. Now, again, Dr. William Colby, ex-CIA director, according to Kay Griggs, was taken out by a Navy SEAL team. And she would say, the Navy SEALs would all be, most of them, homosexually recruited, and they, their graduations exercise to go out and do a cold kill, which is, go kill somebody in a random situation. So these are assassins. And so they apparently had the orders to kill this guy. They didn't even know it was Colby, but the Colby was out there. He was going to testify at something, and then a week before that, this murder happens. Supposedly he's out fishing at 11 o'clock at night on the lake, and it gets overturned and he drowns. There's always a cover story. And but she said
he had a reputation of always talking too much.
But interestingly enough, see, he's one of this group, and
yes.
a lot of this group went to Princeton, and they were in the cap and gown dining club fraternity, much like the Yale Skull and Bones. And so they would have gone through initiation ceremonies, much like the Skull and Bones people.
And that's where Dulles was from, right? Princeton? He graduated from Princeton.
Yes, and Dulles, in fact, was, he trained a lot of these people, according to Kay Griggs, including her husband. Mm-hmm. So he would be the one who was kind of feeding these boys, young men, into these situations where then they become malleable, controllable assets. And of course, if they are homosexually willing, they become rising stars and they go right to the top, because then they can control them better.
They make better nihilists, yeah. If you grow up in a healthy family with mother, father, and you have an example of a healthy sexual relationship and human relations in general, it's very hard to turn you into a stone-cold assassin,
Exactly. And she talks about that and how her husband, he didn't see his parents for 8 years. They were, kind of moved out of the picture. He was brought into a really top-notch prep school and then Princeton. And, and during this time, he's hanging out with all this really rich Saudi families, and they didn't go to classes. They were doing their, parties on the beach or whatever, And, so yeah, it's a very sordid situation. But William Colby would have been one of these people. But yet, here's an example of somebody who, she had the highest regard for Colby. And he was going to come to her defense. He said he was over the phone just before he got killed. And then
that's interesting. Okay, they coincide. Yeah, because it is later. He's killed in the 90s.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Long after his testimony in Capitol Hill in the 70s and these things. But he goes. You're talking Colby. Of course, he was an important figure in the Phoenix program.
Okay. Yeah. Well, a more evil program is hard to find than the Phoenix program. These connections run very, very deep into our establishment, So if you're back in the D.C. area, as I think you are,
mm-hmm.
You'd be surprised, who's doing what, And, these people might have ostensibly, respectable jobs and nice kids, But when you look at what they've been doing, it's psychopathic to the nth degree, and it murder is what you call it. In fact, she used the term wet ops. Her husband would be doing wet ops. Well, what's a wet op? It's murder.
Mm-hmm.
So these are strategic murders. But now this program has gone global, and it has gone mainstream in a covert sort of way. And that's why I wanted to bring this connection in with say, Lockheed Martin. Karen Stewart, who is a NSA whistleblower, now target, says that 47 of our 50 states have contracts now with Lockheed Martin. Well, Lockheed Martin split off in 2016. There was a group called Leidos that split off from Lockheed Martin. If you go to the Lockheed Martin's website, as I've got in front of me right now, and look under C4ISR, that's again the computer system called Command Control, Communications Computer, Intelligence Research, and Reconnaissance. And look at the products that they have to sell. You will see integrated ISR systems. Then of course the military would buy these things. Militaries all over the world, or even states. You will see programs that have electronic warfare capabilities, cyber security capabilities, electronic warfare spectrum dominance, airborne electronic warfare, ground electronic warfare, naval electronic warfare, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so, and then this company Leidos splits off, by the way, there is a website that's just come out called targetedjustice.com. Latest news, 6 February 2018. Based on statements by the FBI, it appears likely that the FBI lists all targeted individuals on the terrorism watch list. the FBI refers to targets, as I said this, to TIs as non-investigative subjects. In other words, just hands off. This term can be used in FOIA requests, though. This is a clue to TIs. The Leidos Corporation in Vienna, Virginia, has a government contract to support these operations, which makes them potentially liable in lawsuits. Okay, source WikiLeaks. 26th of January this year, targeted individual wins a hearing in court. Demurrer hearing in court. Jack Christianita has won a courtroom victory in his case against the chief of police in the city of Huntington Beach. The evidence was overwhelmingly in Mr. Christianita's favor. This proves that targeted individuals can win in court. 22 January 2018, targeted individuals worldwide. We need your help. Help us identify whistleblowers, the Air Force personnel or contractors that work at Peterson Air Force Base or Shriver Air Force Base that are able to confirm that the U.S. Air Force is targeting civilians using microwave military weapons. We suspect that enlisted personnel at Shriver Air Force Base are pushing the button, as this is one of the most top secret bases in the world. Be a detective and help us do the research. LinkedIn shows 4,400 people in Colorado Springs with the keyword satellite. So what's going on here, Tim, is there's a connection now, we don't see it, but between satellites and computers and our brains. And Ronnie Kilda talks about this. And the potential is that they can turn us, as they have turned others, into mind-controlled biological robots. In other words, just like the MK Ultra original remit in 1953 was, the CIA program, we want to get others to do our bidding, even if it's against their self-interest and even their sense of self-preservation. In other words, a Manchurian candidate, somebody who will do an assassination, somebody who will be a sex slave, somebody who will do this. Okay, that's 1953. Here we are, 70 years later, more or less. Oh my God, look what they've done in the last 70 years. And that's my lifetime, I have to tell you. I mean, you know, my whole life has been this, in the sense that this has been behind the scenes, always. And we go back to the patents, we go back to the policies. This has always been in the background, top secret, top secret. This is the Manhattan Project of the mind. And the information's there for those who care to look at it.
Yeah, it's not so much a question of what they're willing to do, or what I'm saying is it's a question of capability. They're not inhibited by morality or by the law or by decency. So it's a question of delving into what's their technological capability, what are their limitations, and if they're able to do it, and they see it's in their interest to do it, they will do it. That's the type of ethics we're dealing with here.
Yeah, absolutely. That was proven, by the original Manhattan Project, which built the atomic bomb in World War II, and then immediately was dropped on Japan. Hey, let's see what. And then they blew up some atomic bombs in space, in 1958, and then they, started playing with all the testing, and then Edward Teller, the original Dr. Strangelove, with Lawrence Livermore Lab, Dr. Edward Teller says, oh, well, let's make harbors in Alaska, using the H-bomb, which he's largely responsible for. So yeah, there's no constraint on using these weapons as soon as they come online. And so figure that these mind control technologies are being used on a tremendous scale worldwide right now. And it's our job then to uncover and expose and legally defeat these operations. And
the mind mapping and that would be necessary for a program like this sort of social control or the ability to map or predict human behavior. I mean, that goes back at least to the Princeton Radio Research Project, or the testing people's reactions to things with the Halloween Eve broadcast or War of the Worlds. It was just a test, but and the use of mass communication for the purposes of mass manipulation is the whole reason why mass communication was studied. I'm reminded of Christopher Simpson's book, The Science of Coercion, and how that was pretty much funded in the 40s by the War Department, then after the war by the CIA. the television, mass communication, then eventually even the internet, right, was sort of allowed to develop for the purposes so they could collect the metadata, so they could develop these mass mind control programs. I'm thinking the Pentagon has all types of, I guess you could call it gaming programs, or to try to game society, and the way they do that is by sucking in all the data, and being able to predict or construct a model for reality. And then they can test certain things. And that's probably one of the reasons why some of these events occur, is testing the public reaction, not just the reaction to the event that people people are reacting to because they genuinely believe the events occurred, but they also probably map or following the reaction in the alt media about those criticize the events as fake events. So we're all kind of being gamed in this system because we're all being monitored.
Yeah, and if you look back again at the 1953 documents that Allen Dulles signed, in April of 1953 to put MK Ultra, that's MK stands for mind control, into practice with 149 sub-projects. I mean, many of these were involving the fields of anthropology, sociology, and psychology. And these social sciences then became weaponized by the CIA grant money so that the CIA could, like you say, learn ways to game the system. And it has not really been admitted. I was reading an article by an anthropologist saying, hey, we as a profession need to own up to the influence that the CIA had on us back in the day when, they were giving us all this grant money, and all that stuff's still under the table. So you might go to university and study anthropology, and you might go study human ecology. And I taught human ecology for 20 years. And, out of geography department. And, you might not know that the Society for Human Ecology was the front name then for a CIA mind control project that was associated with this monster Dr. Ewan Cameron. Yeah. Who was, by the way, head of the World Psychiatric Association, American Psychiatric Association, Canadian Psychiatric Association, and thought that he was going to go and get a Nobel Prize for his noble work. Also 33rd degree Mason. Mm-hmm. And what he did is figure out how to erase the mind and reprogramming it. That's his whole shtick, and he called it depatterning. And then psychic driving, and all of these things have gotten much more sophisticated now that we have electronic means to do this. What would have had to have been done, through trauma-based physical torture to children back in the 40s and 50s and 60s now can be done electronically. So they don't have to take these. So in other words, we don't have to now take these Saudi goat herders and put them in the concentration camps at Abu Ghraib and Gitmo, Guantanamo Bay. We can have an electronic concentration camp tailor-made for, Joe Blow in his home. We can put him in an electronic concentration camp with these frequencies and wavelengths of energy. We can gang-stalk him on the street to knock him back into his home, to, strike fear into and to psychologically destabilize him. So you're absolutely right. I mean, all of these things fit together in a way that is beyond the imagination of most. So it's our responsibility then to kind of fill in the top secret gaps to the best of our ability. Again, a lot of this stuff is classified, but a lot of it's declassified. So let me just read you this, come chapter 10 from a book called Bad Experiments, Why Gang-Stalking Works. And here you'll see the psychological aspect of this and how deliberate it is. Gang-stalking and related psychological attacks are designed to surround, isolate, and eventually destroy its victim. The gang-stalker's routine may develop slow over a period of months or years. The gang-stalker's intent is to completely surround the victim, cut him off from friends, family, and other support systems. Eventually, the victim's 24-hour daily routine is monitored and manipulated by gang-stalkers and other covert operatives. The psychological attack eventually overwhelms the emotion of the victim. He becomes mentally unbalanced. His emotional reserves are depleted, and he is isolated from any support systems that can bolster him. He will eventually react to these relentless psychological attacks in a way that results in incarceration, homelessness, suicide, or death. The gang-stalking methodology falls under a system of psychological operations being developed and tested on American citizens by covert quasi-law enforcement agencies. Okay, so, there's documentation for this stuff. And by the way, there is another, the C4ISR I mentioned. I was watching a YouTube by an ex-military guy. He said in the field they use the term ISR to stand for isolate and remove the civilian target. So this is what's happening. They're trying to emotionally, psychologically break the target down by isolation. This is really part of the MK Ultra Kubark torture. I think that the gang-stalking manual comes right out of MK Ultra and the Kubark torture interrogation manual. Here's what the CIA Human Resources Exploitation Manual says. The purpose of all coercive techniques is to introduce psychological regression in the subject by bringing a superior outside force to bear on his will to resist. Regression is basically a loss of autonomy, a reversion to an earlier behavioral level. As the subject regresses, his learned personality traits fall away in reverse chronological order. He begins to lose the capacity to carry out the highest creative activities, to deal with complex situations, to cope with stressful interpersonal relationships, or to cope with repeated frustrations. Now you see how diabolical this is. This is coming out of the American taxpayers' money. Mm-hmm. We paid for these experiments, and we're paying for these torture programs. This is the American people have been duped on a scale that is very hard to imagine.
Well, how do you restrict these programs to just the bad guys, if there are bad guys out there, right? That's the problem with these things. Obviously, this can be once this is perfected or to an art form or a science, it can be adapted to any person deemed dissonant or problematical to the system, right? I mean, and that could be a legitimate critic that we're supposed to tolerate in a free society, because that's how you keep the system honest and functional, is open it to criticism, right?
Exactly. And that is exactly what has happened. In other words, these elements of torture and spycraft, which were, maybe at first applied in other countries against the quote-unquote communists, are now widely being applied to anybody that gets on these target watch lists, these terrorist watch lists.
Well, this is why you need the continual war system, whether it's the First World War, the Second World War, the Cold War, the War on Terror. There's always a boogeyman out there to justify these programs, and they gotta be. We can't have access to the terror watch list because the terrorists will win. So it has to be secret. Then you're stuck with there's a contradiction there. Well, how do I know if I'm on it or not? Well, you don't know you're on it or not. And you can't know you're on it or not. Therefore, you have no action. There's no action for you to take. Well, that's a circular logic, because it's like the no-fly list, right? You don't find out until you can't get on an airplane at some point. Then you can't find out why you're on it, and there's no recourse for these things. Just like the surveillance, the lawsuit a few years ago, that there was a group of people who sued the NSA over this the surveillance program. And they said that this was a violation of the Bill of Rights, of the Fourth Amendment, of the First Amendment, and these things. And they sued in court. And the Supreme Court ruled that the litigants had no standing because they can't prove they're targeted because the target's secret. I mean,
yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. Well, again, it's this brotherhood is what they call themselves, mm-hmm. according to Kay Briggs, or the firm, which, has their bases covered. So many of these judges would have been former, 20-year military people who have the connections then with the rest of the brotherhood. And they would now be what's called JAGs, or judicial judge advocate generals. Mm-hmm. And, like this guy Stanley Sporkin, who threw out the case of Acquay versus the NSA in 1992. Acquay was an ex-NSA guy who understood what was going on. He sued the NSA, and he was a target, of course. And, we're talking about signals intelligence and all this very, very sophisticated computer stuff. And in his lawsuit, he lays out what happened, mm-hmm. what is happening. And that's 1992 technology, which is more advanced than the average human being can even fathom.
Yeah.
And yet it's in this lawsuit, and Judge Stanley Sporkin, again, a judge, advocate general, a JAG, connected to the Brotherhood, threw it out,
he was he was a lawyer with the CIA who helped cover up Iran-Contra
There you go.
And I believe he was rewarded with an appointment to the federal judiciary for those efforts. He was the legal. What's the position of the CIA? Legal, not legal. I forget what the position. But basically, he's there to supposedly to tell the CIA if they're doing something illegal or not. He helped cover up the Iran-Contra thing and the drug connection, these things, a lot of other things, and he got a federal bench appointment, and that's how they control the judiciary. Is the good guys, the honest guys, don't get appointed.
Again, the fast track then is reserved for the people who will go to the swinging parties, like Kay Griggs says, and homosexually engage or bisexually engage with other members of the firm. In other words, they're having these very debauched parties, and this is where the pedophilia comes in. And this goes way back, to the German disease, the pink triangle, the Nazi military establishment, which a lot of which came over, as you know, in Operation Paperclip. Kay Griggs says, "Hey, we're not talking a few thousand people here. Her uncle or her grandfather was directly involved in this, and he says over 200,000 Germans were brought into this country over a time span, and with them came this practice. Then, especially, this kind of cherry marine thing, where now you've got these, and she also talks about these teams of flamers, where you have one Marine teamed up with a Mossad guy or Israeli, and they are, kind of a couple. And they do assassinations, and the Mossad guy will do the assassination in America to take care of the jurisdictional problems, and the American guy will do the assassinations elsewhere or whatever.
Well, at least it's legal.
Well, that's right. They want to stay legal or more legal. I mean, if you can call murder legal, but yeah, these jurisdictional issues, but they've gotten around it. I mean, look at this way, Tim. I mean, we just have this scandal now with the Nunes memo. And, according to Dr. Adrian Krieg, I listened to an interview that he did, this is the biggest scandal that's ever hit American history. And, makes Watergate look like a bunch of Girl Scouts. And, because now you have these intelligence agencies, targeting President Trump and, and General Flynn and this volunteer, So now General Flynn's homeless, can't pay for his defense costs and the abuses of the FISA system, et cetera.
They hired Fusion GPS. This
isn't that a great name?
Yeah, Fusion GPS. Yeah, and that goes to what you're saying about what this program is. The sort of the universality of this program.
Absolutely. And, as I go down these rabbit holes, I start to realize I read things like, well, every good intelligence operation has 5 levels of deception, Well, okay, so let's look at this. Is this a limited hangout? I mean, okay, now they're talking violations of the FISA. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Well, just, this particular scandal, which is actually an example, I think, of this kind of counterintelligence stalking on, an incumbent president, of all things, and his associates. This is nothing compared to what's going on globally and in America with the complete abandonment of all law by putting people on these terrorism watch lists, and then the FBI classifies them, as non-investigative subjects. In other words, they have no protections. They don't know why they're on the list. They've lost their constitutional protections, and whatever corporation or university wants to test their microwave weapons or test their mind control, cloning, their remote neural monitoring. Capabilities, which, by the way, they had in 1992, according to Ackway versus the NSA, and they've only gotten much more sophisticated since. So, in other words, these individuals then have been written off by the nation and the legal portion of the nation, and can then be, murdered with impunity.
Yeah, I mean, sounds crazy to the normal guy, but Zbigniew Brzezinski, remember him?
Oh, yeah.
Council on Foreign Relations, Club of Rome. He was hired by David Rockefeller to create the Trilateral Commission in 1973. He was the director for several years, foreign policy advisor to Hubert Humphrey, Jimmy Carter's national security advisor for 4 years. Well, this is what he wrote. So this isn't a crack. Well, he may be a crackpot, not the crackpot in the sense that we mean it. He's an establishment guy, a lot of influence. He writes, political strategists are tempted to exploit research on brain and human behavior. Geophysicist Gordon J.F. MacDonald, specialist in problems of warfare, says accurately timed, artificially excited electronic strokes can lead to a pattern of oscillations that produce relatively high power levels over certain regions of the Earth. In this way, one could develop a system that would seriously impair the brain performance of very large populations in selected regions over an extended period. No matter how deeply disturbing the thought of using the environment to manipulate behavior for national advantages, to some, the technology permitting such use will very probably develop within the next few decades. I think it was written 20 years ago. And he goes,
I think it might be his 1970 book, Between Two Ages.
Yeah, so that's 1970.
America's role in the technotronic era. Yeah, and he's saying, that these technologies are going to give the leaders the means of controlling the weather, doing state-sponsored terrorism that way, and also controlling minds. And of course, HAARP, the High Active Frequency Auroral Research Program in Gakona, Alaska, one of these ionospheric heaters, has the potential then for manipulating the emotional states and moods and mind processes of large regions of the world.
Yeah, Mrs. Brzezinski, we remember him showing up on CNN.
Yes.
MSNBC, even Fox News, they're mainstream media guy, mainstream books, but then Americans don't read, right? But he in other courses, the technotronic era involves the gradual appearance of a more controlled society. Such a society would be dominated by an elite, unrestrained by traditional values. Soon it will be possible to assert almost continuous surveillance over every citizen and maintain up-to-date complete files containing even the most personal information about the citizen. These files will be subject to instantaneous retrieval by the authorities. Well, now we have the internet, right? And we have cell phones everywhere, cell towers, and every purchase is monitored, or you could argue every thought is monitored, because they can just, by our internet searches, they can reconstruct what we're thinking, how we think, and what our views are, and then we can be put in a file somewhere, and should we become troublesome or something, we can be targeted.
Absolutely, and we are being targeted. Yeah. And I'll throw out another thing here, Tim, and I really appreciate your comments. That every one of them is right to the point. 1940s, Ray Kurzweil, just happens also to be a Jew, as many of these individuals are, like Brzezinski and Soros and, Kissinger and blah, 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 blah. He writes a book called Cybernetics, and this then becomes the focus then of a series of conferences called the Macy Conferences in the 40s and 50s that were led by Gregory Bateson and his wife, Margaret Mead. Gregory Bateson is, among other things, the guy who came up with the double bind. We might get to just define that in a second. But then this idea then gets picked up again in the 60s with Ray Kurzweil. He's talking about, now the Macy Conference is also known as the Man-Machine Conferences. Okay, so what they're envisioning is a kind of a merging, a fusion then of computers and the human mind, and the cybernetics would be the control of the human organism through the central nervous system. So again, the idea is biological robots are going to be produced here, and this is the long-term goal. And Ray Kurzweil then is talking about the singularity, the point where computers get smarter than we are, and if we're lucky, they'll look at us as pets, and otherwise they'll look at us as food, kind of thing. And this singularity event is supposed to happen, they say 2040, or some would say it's happened now. But this is something that these guys really have been working hard to bring about, because what they want, and I think this is very key, although this is in the background, what they want, I believe, for this insider group is immortality. They want just what the serpent, tempted Adam and Eve with in the garden. They want immortality. They want to live as gods forever.